Hey everyone, welcome back to the Caderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Caderna. So we got another great guest on the show today who is none other than Srividya Jandhyala, also goes by Vidya. So let me give you a quick background on my guest and then we'll dive into today's conversation. So today's biggest risks in business aren't coming just from your competitors down the street. They're coming from Beijing, Brussels, and of course, Washington, D.C. From sanctions and supply chain shocks to the US-China tech rivalry, geopolitics is a boardroom issue affecting all of us. In her new book, Vidya discusses the Great Disruption, how geopolitics is changing companies, managers, and work, which is out now, and I'll put that in the show notes for today's episode. Dr. Vidya Jandhyala is an associate professor at ESSEC Business School and a former Fung Global Fellow at Princeton University. She shows why companies need to treat geopolitics as seriously as their own balance sheets. But without further ado, Vidya, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think this is such a timely topic. I know I've spoken a lot about it even in my book, What Should I Do With My Money, from more of a personal finance and economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I know you dive into it really of how it's affecting businesses. Maybe a good starting point for us. The first chapter of your book is titled Changing Global Order. We hear a lot, the changing global order. Can you define in your terms what exactly that looks like today?
Sure. Maybe I can start with thinking about who are the managers who are leading companies today. They
Okay.
are probably people who went to business school 15, 20 years ago, who were trained and had an experience of their business careers at a time and an era which was in some ways quite different from what we are facing today. Um, i- at that time, geopolitics was still relevant, was still extremely relevant, except it was a way of opening doors. It was creating a tailwind. It was allowing companies to expand overseas, creating new markets, the ability to enter sectors that were previously regulated. And so, in a way, when people went to business school, they learned how to read financial statements and they figured out how to uh, sell their products and services to new and old customers and thought carefully about their operations, maximizing it for efficiency gains. And today's world is quite different from what many of them might have grown up in
Sure.
and what they face. So I think that's kind of where I'm going with what I see as being different.
Got it. And so I guess two questions that kind of come off of that. Number one, you hear that so much in academia that we're teaching kind of old news, that people, they're going in freshman year, they're graduating 4 or 5 years later, and then they're coming out with outdated skill sets. What are you maybe talking about? How should professors be teaching their students right now, knowing that things are changing so quick and that 4 years from today, who knows what the world will look like versus where we're at right now?
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the wrong set of skills that we are teaching our students. I think it's just the environment may shift, but
Hmm.
some of the skills are still the same. You still need to be able to read your environment. You still need to be able to figure out how to compete when the environment is changing. The specific types of changes are different, right? So we may not be able to foretell or foresee whether this is going to be a particular type of geopolitical change or whether this is going to be some kind of technological change or whether AI is going to take all of our jobs. But I think the skills that we try to provide students, but also just equip all of us with, is the ability to keep learning,
Hmm.
to keep it's suddenly there's no more this model of I go to college for 4 years and then I'm set for the rest of my career. I think
Hmm.
that's long gone. We all have to keep investing in our own skill set. Lifelong learning is definitely a thing. So I think the
Sure.
ability to learn and learning how to learn, that's probably, I would say, the main focus.
Yeah, 100%. I think everybody agrees, learning's a lifelong journey. Once you stop, you don't even stand still. You usually go backwards. People are passing you. But with that said, going back to kind of this changing global order, I know you use that time frame of what were people being taught 15, 20 years ago. From a geopolitical stage, I think a lot of it was just the rise of the internet taking over. China was starting to really climb as like the second world power. America was the undisputed number one by, head and shoulders above the rest of the pack. Now, here we are in 2025. I know everybody's saying you've got China and you've got the US. Can you maybe kind of dive into a little of the nuance? If you're in a boardroom, what should we be paying mind to right now when you are talking about geopolitics?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally what you need to be thinking about is if you are a company that is in any way, shape, or form engaged in global business. And by that, I mean, you don't have to be a multinational company. You could have suppliers elsewhere. You could have customers elsewhere. You could simply be exporting, whatever it is. The
Hmm.
fundamental thing that you need to ask yourself, and the way I think like really geopolitics is affecting companies is what is the institutional infrastructure or support structure that companies need to engage in international commerce. Right? So this would be things like I should have confidence that I'm going to be paid by a customer that is halfway across the world and has a completely different legal system and in a different jurisdiction. So simple things like that. I
Hmm.
should have confidence that when I invest in a market that is different from where my company is located, that this investment is going to be safe, that I'm going to be able to compete with other companies over there in a way that is somewhat of a level playing field. That
Hmm.
that assets that the company invests in are going to be safe and secure, and people that I human capital and employees and expatriate managers are going to be safe and secure. And so I think essentially you've got to be asking yourself, what is it that gives me confidence to engage in
Hmm.
international commerce? And I think that's fundamentally what is changing. So most of
How so?
most of what happened in the last 20 or 30 years was actually building up this structure. Right? So we as a global community, invested a lot in creating mechanisms that facilitate these types of international transactions. So let me give you a few examples.
Sure.
We invested a lot in creating, for example, the World Trade Organization that set some rules that we all agreed that we would kind of abide by, or the member countries agreed that they would abide by in terms of what would be appropriate tariff rates. What would we do if we disagree on what has happened? If we have issues about dumping or we invested in creating a system of investment treaties that gave companies confidence that if I invest abroad, I have a legal mechanism of resolving a dispute with a foreign government in a country that's far away. For much of the 90s and the early 2000s, we were kind of investing in these types of structural mechanisms that would help sustain and give confidence to companies when they're investing abroad. And now I think things are changing in that structural mechanisms that we invested in before are no longer as stable.
Hmm.
And so we have to start thinking about alternate ways that we can find companies can be supported in the investments.
But I think like going back to the WTO and saying, okay, we have a framework, which I agree, maybe in the past it was stable, but I think people would argue, yes, it was stable, but it was ineffective. If you look at, we have all these players kind of or teams within the league and we have a set of rules to abide by. And then if we pick out China, for instance, and you see, rampant, IP theft and fraud, who knows what about kind of how their workers and employees are taken care of there. And then the dumping, the environmental concerns, all of those things, it's kind of like they gave just a list of rules and infractions that they had that they were breaking, but it didn't seem like there was ever any sort of kind of punishment or slap on the wrist for everything that they had done through all that time, right?
So, and I mean, the system was not perfect. So I'm not suggesting that it was a great system that worked every single time. The system was not perfect, but I think the ideal was there. Like the ideal system, or in a world where if we could imagine how we would build this up brick by brick, suddenly, maybe the WTO was one brick. And we
Yeah.
still had a long way to go in terms of figuring out how we would address every single issue that came up. But it was suddenly a brick that was,
Mhm.
kind of building that tower. And yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it was going in that direction.
Yeah, and I agree. Like you need to have kind of those bricks to build that foundation. But I guess what everybody would kind of look at is like, all right, if we have kind of the good guys, they're gonna see the rule book, they're gonna recognize and honor the referee, and they're gonna try their best to play the game. But then if you have other, huge economies that frankly don't care, and this is going to be picking on, Russia, China, sometimes Mexico with all of the dumping and some of the environmental concerns there. Like it was kind of, I guess everybody was like, all right, we have this rule book, but if there's nothing to be enforced, I honestly can't think of over the past 10, 20 years, like where there was severe penalty from the organization against one of these countries that was not abiding. And I guess that's why everybody kind of was like, what's the point of this? It's like the good guys are doing the good thing and the bad guys are just saying, screw it, we'll play by our own rules. And it just didn't seem, and I think that's where people lose trust kind of in that system. So maybe what do you think would be like an alternative or that next brick to make it more effective?
I think fundamentally what companies, I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a business decision, right? So whether a company chooses to invest in another product, in another market, in another sector, it's still going to be a business decision, right? So this is going to
Mhm.
be, when am I going to make money? When am I going to see returns? How profitable is this investment going to be? These are, I think, the foundational, fundamental ways that companies, doesn't matter where you are located or where you're from,
Yeah.
fundamentally, these are going to be the guiding questions for most managers trying to decide if they want to make an investment or not. Now, anything that would give them greater confidence of making sure that they can get those returns or that they can execute their plans in a way that they intend to, um, uh, would help them take more risk in some sense. And by
Hmm.
that, I mean they're willing to invest in markets that are far away. They're willing to invest in sectors that they didn't have experience before, or look at markets where their home is very different from, like they don't understand necessarily the lay of the land, but
Yeah.
having these types of structures would help them have more confidence in making that investment, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's the kind of thing that, where do we go? I think that's the way I think about this, right? So the
Hmm.
analogy I often like to use is like a game of Jenga. So you build up a
Yeah.
tower, and the tower, I mean, it's made of little bricks. It's not perfect, but the tower stands and the game starts. So you start knocking out one by one. And at
Yeah.
first, the tower still stands, right? So it starts getting wobbly, but the tower still stands. But at some point, the tower collapses. The last brick is one brick too many, and then the tower collapses. So this is, I think, what the way I think about the framework that companies need in order to have confidence and invest overseas. So it need not be perfect. It just needs to be
Hmm.
like the Jenga tower that is stable enough to let them do that.
Yeah.
And as long as you keep chipping away at it, at some point that's going to collapse.
And kind of again looking, and I like this analogy here. I mean, looking at all these different bricks, I feel that some are more important than others. And I think any company, especially a public company, where their first kind of responsibility is to their shareholders and to be profitable. I feel like it's just the reality that money trumps everything. Because you could have a company that at face value is trying to do all the kind of checking all the boxes of the buzzwords, the diversity, equity, inclusion, the clean energy, the employee rights, every single thing that we want to see that we would consider to be like noble. And then they'll produce everything that they have in China, which could be the antithesis of so many of these kind of noble causes. But when they just look at the math of, hey, that's where it's cheapest to source our goods or to have it manufactured and so forth, it's almost like they have these conflicting ideas of like, we're saying we want to be this company, we're trying to be this company, but for financial reasons, we're putting all of our resources over here where maybe they're not in line with our ideals. I just feel like it's so hard to kind of organically flip the script there, um, because they kind of prefer just to kind of keep that under the carpet and like, all right, we'll kind of be silent about where all of your t-shirts and hats or golf clubs or wherever it's all coming from. So I guess my question is like, all the bricks matter, but is the money brick like critical? Like, obviously, like, is that one that we can somehow play with? And if so, like, how, without tariffs, sanctions, subsidies, without all different financial incentives, like, how do we affect that brick?
I mean, I think you touch upon a very relevant point, which is, the idea that companies are driven to make decisions, whatever the decision making criteria are, right? So they have their own set of criteria in determining whether they're going to invest or not. But the issue is the externalities. And by that, I mean the cost of what an individual company is doing is often felt by others that are not part of the company, right? So these externalities
Mhm.
are going to matter. And that's exactly how I think geopolitics is impacting companies, right? If you take a company like NVIDIA,
Yeah.
maybe they want to keep selling their chips in the Chinese market because maybe that's a great business decision, right? So maybe this is a way for them to increase their revenues, a way for them to know their customers better. Maybe if they were to think of this in the absolute, in a commercial sense, maybe the best thing for them to do is to continue to sell those chips in countries around the world.
Mhm.
But maybe the externalities of that decision to invest is seen by other actors. So maybe the US government, for example, is concerned about technology leakage or the use of these chips for other types of purposes. Um,
Mhm.
and on the Chinese side, maybe they're worried about dependence on an American company for critical resources that they see. So these externalities are exactly why governments get in the business of regulating where companies go, how they invest, where they should invest, and that's certainly the case for geopolitics and the relationship to national security as well.
Gotcha. So I guess and I agree with everything you just said. I guess my question is like, kind of, if you were at the helm, if you're the president of the US, or if you were kind of governing some global organization, what would be the first thing that you would come in and say, hey, everybody, this is what we need to do? And then let's go from there. Like, what would that number one command be?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single thing. I think, again, to go back to the analogy of the Jenga, it's not a single brick, right? So
Yeah.
I,
Well,
I
maybe
don't
what
think
are like
it's,
the top three? What are like, if you come in and you've got
yeah.
everybody's attention at some global summit for 20 minutes, like what are your bullet points?
So I would say four things, right? So
Okay.
one is companies care about having market access. And so if they're making an investment, they want to know that this investment is something that they could continue to engage with. So some confidence about having market access. So that's one thing. The second
Mhm.
thing is ensuring that somehow they're on a level playing field. And that includes a level playing field with domestic companies, foreign companies versus domestic companies, but also foreign companies from other countries. So it doesn't matter where you're from, in some way that you have somewhat of a level playing field. That so the competition then shifts to market characteristics rather than where you're from.
Mhm.
The third thing would be ensuring investment security. And so whether this is physical assets, whether this is human capital, whether this is intellectual assets, so just ensuring that companies have the ability to safeguard their investments, to repatriate earnings, to make sure that they are confident in investment security. And then, for me, the final piece of the puzzle is really standards or institutional alignment. So, if you think about a USB stick, you take it anywhere in the world, almost any computer, you can stick it in and it will work. But if you
Mhm.
think about charging your computer, usually you have to fiddle around with all kinds of chargers and adapters. So the fact that you have different standards around the world is going to make it much harder for companies to be able to overcome those costs of adaptation and figuring out the lay of the land. So for me, it would be these four things. So ensuring market access or continued market access,
Mhm.
a level playing field, investment security, and institutional alignment.
Okay. And just for, the listener that might be saying, okay, these things are all like very important, but I don't fully grasp it. Maybe they're not reading the Wall Street Journal or, the Economist every month. Um, can you give like an example of those four? Like when you say kind of this global access, I think a lot of people would say, isn't that already there? Like we're doing business all around the world. Can you maybe show us, like in each of those four bullet points, where there's a true hurdle right now that is affecting, the global order?
Sure. So when we decide, for example, that um, uh, a company is not allowed to operate in a country. Okay? So, for
Hmm.
example, um, for various reasons, TikTok is a company that has faced a lot of pushback in the United States,
Hmm.
and to the extent that TikTok is banned or not allowed to operate anymore, they will, in some sense, not have access to a market that they have invested a lot of resources in. That they
Hmm.
have invested not just financial resources, but a lot of managerial effort and investment as well. So they would lose access to a market that they previously used to have access to and that they invested in to compete in. So
Hmm.
that would be an example of how market access could be not available to all companies. Um,
Hmm.
if you think about level playing field, if today if you look around the world, exporters of the exact same product face different tariff rates in the United States. So if you are a shrimp farmer in India and you want to export your shrimp to the United States, today you're facing a 50% tariff rate. But if you are a shrimp farmer from, say, Ecuador, then your tariff rate is much lower. So in some sense, then the competition is no longer about what's the quality of the shrimp or what is the product features. Then we're simply looking at making a choice between exporters based on their nationality because the playing field has been changed in that way. So that, to me, is an example of ensuring level playing field. If you think about investment security, now, if you are a company that invested in Russia, so let's say you're a Western multinational that invested in Russia,
Yep.
you may have issues or you may have some challenges in trying to repatriate any earnings from there if you didn't already exit. Or if you decide to exit at this point, you are basically taking the terms that are given to you by the Russian state. So that, in a way, is an example of where your investment is you're not quite confident about the returns from a foreign investment. You could also think about human capital, right? So if as a company, the headquarters decides we want expatriate managers in all the locations that we have operations in, how confident are you today as a multinational company that you're willing to send expatriate managers to different locations that you have operations in? Okay, so it's both physical as well as managerial resources, where you want to be sure that these investments are secure, that you can move people back and forth as of course abiding by the rules, but
Sure.
have some idea of what those rules are and how you navigate the system. And then if you think about standards, if you think about institutional alignment, the example that comes to mind is e-commerce. Okay, so if you are a small seller, say you have an Etsy store or some kind of e-commerce on any of these e-commerce pages, and you decide you want to accept payments from others. And so you have to make decisions about what payment gateways you want to have. And increasingly, this is fractured, right? So depending on where your customers are, the type of payment gateways and the type of payment systems that they have access to or that they're familiar with are actually quite different. So you have to make a decision about, okay, so which markets am I focused on? It's no longer here's the default, and if I kind of check this box, that pretty much opens access to many markets around the world. Now I have to decide, do I choose a payment gateway that taps into a particular market that's more common, let's say in China, versus Russia, versus India, versus the US, right? So that's a system, an institutional system that's actually quite different around the world. And a small exporter, in this case, has to make a decision about these types of things.
Okay, got it. So if I could kind of summarize it, first, I guess what I should ask you is, are you a proponent or one of the other? Because it sounds like what you just laid out is like a purely free market economy, where the ideas, the products, the funds can flow freely, as if like these countries didn't have borders. They could kind of go everywhere. We're all the same. We're all just one gigantic global economy. And then that's under the assumption that all of the flows of money and product and employees are protected, that it's safe. It sounds like that's kind of what you're describing. I guess my question is, are you a proponent of that? Or are you on the other side of kind of more regulating, breaking up all these different country by country? What's your opinion on it?
So I don't think I'm necessarily on one camp or the other. I mean, certainly, we've seen both the huge benefits as well as the big challenges. If you think about globalization and if you think about free markets, I think, and just in the last few years, we've seen, millions of people coming out of poverty, but we've also seen the flip side where we've had, tons of locations around the world that have been had adverse impact of this kind of global flow. So I don't necessarily say one or the other. I think we need to be careful as we are designing these systems for sure, but there is a reason that is valuable as well. Right? So I think the most useful way to think about this is when we think about ideas and knowledge and innovation, the reason that having, kind of global flows helps, is that that's a way that you will come up with solutions that otherwise you wouldn't, because you're not tapping into big pools of knowledge. But also
Mhm.
because if we think about global problems, and I mean problems that go beyond a single country's borders, we obviously need global solutions, right? So we cannot address global problems by just thinking about this as a country by country type of problem. So that's where I come from, which is saying there are types of problems for which you need to have some kind of global coordination. And those types of
Mhm.
problems are very difficult to solve if you're just looking at this as individual attempts.
Okay. And I guess the question everybody, especially, any CEOs or executives listening to this are saying, well, tell me about the future. What can I expect? Because I think the consensus right now is if you look at some of these other areas, if you look at a Russia, if you look at a China, they can afford to have a 20 or 30 or even 40-year timeline of where they're guiding their economy. Where over here in the US, we essentially have like a 4-year timeline that is constantly changing when you think of what could happen from the White House, what might the narrative and the direction be. I think obviously a lot of people right now are saying, okay, we've got to play by some of these own American rules that are getting stronger and we need to abide by them, or else the White House can, slap us on the wrist and it's going to be harder. We're going to be put in the penalty box. So we're going to be getting hit with different tariffs and different penalties in that respect. Whereas others might say, let me just kind of hang on. And then if we have a new administration, they'll let me go crazy again in China, Russia, India, or wherever I can go make a profit. Um, where do you think the tide is headed? Like as a company, what are the Apples, the Nvidias? What are these companies trying to do? Are they trying to just kind of placate the current administration, or is there going to be a sea change of where we manufacture, where we kind of do all of these things? Are we going to become a little more isolationist, or is it like a passing fad?
So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm able to look into the crystal ball as well as the next person, but I think
Hmm.
what is to me, what I think are some of the indicators is how difficult some changes might actually be, right? And by that I mean, so if you think about your and my daily lives, we make lots of decisions every single day about our own preferred, let's say, brand of what we use at home or what you choose for work and so on. When do you make a change? When do you decide I no longer am going to use or buy this brand of cereal? Maybe your doctor told you something, right? So you need some kind of big event to make you decide that you are going to reevaluate a choice that you already made that seems to be working just fine for you. And
Hmm.
when that happens, you're going to make a change. But once you've made a change, and then that's going to stick for a while until some other reason makes you reevaluate that change. And I think for a lot of companies, that's exactly the flux that we are seeing right now. And by that, I mean, they're having to reevaluate some of the assumptions of what led to their decisions. For example, just-in-time supply chains, right? So they're having to reevaluate the very fundamental assumption about our supply chains have to be efficient, they have to be just-in-time. And so now we're seeing kind of reevaluation of that um, ethos of supply chain systems. Now, this means that there are going to be changes that are going to happen that even, let's say, there's a change in tariff rates, specific tariff rates, or there are changes in specific rules, unless and until it directly impacts the change that this company has made, they're not going to go back and reevaluate. So um, if, for example, an exporter has lost market share because they now have a relative disadvantage in terms of tariff rates, the tariff rates may go away in the future, but they're going to find it doubly hard to regain a customer that they lost. It's easier to keep a customer than to gain a new one, even if that new one was one that you had before, because that new customer or that customer now has a new supplier, and the new supplier seems to be working fine. So why would they come back to you unless there was some reason to? So the way I think about this, at least, is flux is a time where there's a lot of changes that are happening to how companies are organized, and they're reevaluating their supply chains, and they're kind of rethinking their kind of competitive advantage, what's driving their competitive advantage. And these changes are going to be somewhat sticky. They're not necessarily easy to reverse. And strategic decisions by their very nature are things that are difficult to reverse. So um, it's not something that we can just kind of say, tomorrow I'll switch this back or I'll turn on the tap again and it will be back to the same.
Yeah. And I guess you brought up kind of an interesting point a lot of people want to know about is, will the tariffs stay? That was something we saw in Trump's first term where he came out very strong on the idea of tariffs. It was kind of very brand new to most people. And it was targeted directly at China. And some people were for it. A lot of people were against it. But then we had 4 years with an entirely different administration, and all of those tariffs stayed in effect. And then we had kind of Trump 2.0 come in and say, okay, that's all there. And now we're going to take it to the next level. And I think what, my understanding was, all right, we targeted China as, kind of who we wanted to go after. But then companies are smart enough to say, okay, well, we can have China sell the product over here, and then we'll just buy it from that country and kind of circumvent that tariff and make it pointless. Which is where you're seeing more of this kind of more global take this time around. Whether you like them or not, do you think the tariffs, once we kind of settle into a new world order, as you say, do you think it'll change, or will we just kind of adapt to that new framework?
I think, companies, managers are smart people. They're just busy people and have many things on their plate. So they are constantly optimizing and trying to figure out how to run their companies. That's probably front and central for most of what they do.
Mhm.
But to the extent that they are going to make choices, so the US is one big, large market for many companies, but not all companies. And there's also, if there is talk about diversifying the exporters' markets or diversifying sources or trade dependence among other types of countries. And so all of this is changing at the same time. So it's not just about US tariffs, but at the same time,
Mhm.
there is trade between, let's say, China and Brazil that is also changing at the same time, or the extent of relationships between India and Russia. All of this is changing at the same time. So I don't think it's necessarily here's one dimension on which we are playing. There's actually many
Mhm.
changes that are going on at the same time.
Yeah, no, there definitely is a very, very large trickle effect, and it's hard to see. I mean, I don't think you really fully understand that until long after it's in effect. So, kind of switching gears a little bit, because I think that's where a lot of people listening can kind of benefit is through the learning. You're a professor. What classes are you teaching? And maybe what is like your favorite one that you teach?
So I'm teaching classes broadly on global businesses, global strategic management, international business, geopolitics. So bringing these kinds of issues into the classroom, trying to think
Mhm.
about how companies operate in global markets and what are some of the challenges that they face, and not necessarily geopolitical, but also organizational and strategic, and trying to figure out how to compete.
And so when you teach these class, like we said, we want them to come out, you kind of stated the obvious, most important thing is that you always got to be learning. Aside from teaching your students, hey, don't just take this and walk away, stay educated, keep your finger on the pulse, watch the news, get different sources. What are you kind of showing them, I guess, beyond that in like a practical sense, if you could, that then they'll say, okay, if I'm joining this company or if I'm already an executive and I'm taking a graduate course with you, I'm going to take this and immediately adopt it within my company. Do you have any of those kind of nuggets that you could share with us?
I think a couple of things that we try to do. One is at my school at ESSEC, we're really big on um, learning by doing, but also implications for practice. So we're
Mhm.
always trying to bring either speakers or projects or company visits and so on. So a lot of what we do in the classroom is immediately um, complemented by practical learning. And so
Mhm.
oftentimes we will have participants and students who will see the implication of what they are learning in the classroom in somehow in real life. And those
Sure.
kinds of learnings really stick with them. That's the kind of thing that they feel like, oh, I kind of see now what happened. And I kind of
Yeah.
feel I have a better sense of understanding of what this means. And where it applies, or I've seen this in practice, and that tends to stick with them.
Do you have anything maybe over the past 6 months to a year, whether it be on your own research or from one of these guest lecturers, that was like an aha moment that you said, okay, this is something that needs to be taught universally?
So one of the things that I also discuss in the book, and that for me was like a way of thinking about companies' impact by geopolitics, is the understanding that the risk to global companies really is about where you're from. Right. So
Hmm.
the risk to global companies is the fundamental risk is about corporate nationality. And what I mean by that, so a lot of the competition that is happening among companies, we tend to think of this as who has the better product, who has more efficient sales, who can innovate faster. We tend to think about these types of events or these types of characteristics on which companies compete, right? But increasingly, the defining feature of geopolitical risk is corporate nationality, like where you're from. And so let me give you an example. Uh, if you were to take a direct flight from, let's say Helsinki to Tokyo, that flight, and Finnair launched that service, took about 9.5 hours in late 2019, early 2020.
Hmm.
By 2023, that exact same flight was taking about 2.5 hours or 3 hours longer. And it was taking longer, not because the two cities had grown further apart, obviously not, and certainly not in a short period of time, but it was taking longer because Western carriers were not allowed to fly over Russian airspace once the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out. But
Hmm.
Chinese carriers were still able to fly over Russian airspace. So if you are a passenger who's trying to get from, let's say, Beijing to London, uh, your choice of carriers is no longer about how good is the in-flight entertainment, or how comfortable are the seats, or how good is the service. You're actually making a decision in part based on what is the nationality of the carrier, because that is going to define how long this flight is going to take, therefore how much fuel it's going to have to carry, and ultimately what the price of that flight is going to be. And if you look
Hmm.
at just kind of like the airflow, the air traffic between Europe and Asia, you see that a lot of Chinese carriers have increased the number of flights from China to Europe, but at the
Huh.
same time, a lot of European carriers have actually cut their flights from Europe to China. So, in a way, what is the defining feature of the way that geopolitics is impacting companies' operations is thinking about corporate nationality. Like, where are you from?
That's
That's
interesting.
essentially the question.
Yep. And I mean, that's a great point. And I think what would be even more interesting is seeing like as that flow of that air traffic changes and who the carriers are, who the passengers are.
Mhm.
I wonder if they've looked into that as well and seen, hey, Europeans are traveling just as much as always. It's just now they're all doing it on Chinese owned planes and carriers. Or has the passenger base also changed where now it's Europeans are just traveling less, maybe because of that, and now you're seeing maybe more from China. Have you heard any? Have they looked at that by chance?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of both. Um,
Yeah.
5 years ago, certainly pre-COVID, uh, many managers would like to have had a stint in China. Like this was a global manager, a global executive uh, would benefit a lot from a stint in China, whether they ended up
Mhm.
spending a long time or not, whether they ended up like several decades or not. Certainly, having a stint in China was useful for their CVs, was useful for their
Sure.
kind of subsequent progression. I think that's changing as well, right? So I think there's a lot of them that are now looking and saying, maybe I want to make a different choice, and maybe it doesn't have the same kind of returns or attractiveness as it did in the past. So I think there's a little bit of both.
Has anything replaced that? Where, like you said, back in the day, maybe doing a stint in China was a rite of passage to become a powerful global executive or leader. If now maybe that's somewhat frowned upon or not seen as necessary, is there a country that now it's you got to spend some time there to kind of earn your stripes?
I don't know if there's a single country, but certainly there's a few places where I see increasing attractiveness. One, I think Singapore has seen quite a bit of increase in generally
Mhm.
being an attractive location for a lot of managers trying to get global experience. We've also seen the Middle East becoming
Mhm.
another location where both companies as well as managers are thinking about investing and having a stint in that region as well. So I see a little bit of both.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, there's so much to touch on here when you're talking about kind of the global world order here. It's obviously it's enormous. And that's why I love economics, is it just has like kind of so many tentacles. But maybe to pivot, if we could, Vidya, and go into our lightning round where we get to know a little bit about you and what makes you tick and think the way that you think. Can we fire off some questions here and you tell us first thing that comes to mind?
Okay, we can try that.
Awesome. All right. So first up, what is your favorite book?
I think I like historical fiction as a category,
Okay.
and I'm willing to try a lot of different types of books.
Does one stand out?
I'm currently reading a book that is set in late colonial India. So that's what's currently on my reading list.
Okay, interesting. And do you have a favorite movie?
I'm not one for much of movies.
Okay, more of a reader. Understood. And if you had a quote to live by, what would it be?
Sorry, can you say your question again?
Yeah, favorite quote or mantra?
Ah, fail and try again.
Perfect. And do you have a favorite vacation or destination?
I like the mountains a lot. Not everyone in my family does, but so whenever I can get away
Uh,
and get to the mountains, I think that's always
yeah,
very good vacation.
yeah, good way to refresh for sure. And so this show, it all began as a personal finance show. Obviously, I'm a financial advisor by day. Could you share with us maybe the best investment that you've made in your life?
Probably the best investment for me was education. I think
Mhm.
in general, that's the biggest multiplier that for, um, and certainly it has been for me.
Okay, great. And on the flip side, do you have a bad investment, something you wish you could rewind the clock and change?
I think not taking personal finance seriously enough in my early 20s and early in my career, I think is something that I would go back and fix.
Okay, all right, great. And if you could change the world today, what's the one thing that you would want to do?
I would say take a moment to listen. Um, People usually have a point if we stop and listen and try to understand what someone else is trying to say.
Perfect. And if you could ask a question out there and get an answer, what is the one burning question maybe that you take to bed at night and you just can't wrap your head around?
For me, it is or how do we get people to cooperate?
Got it. Yeah, that's and that's a big one. All right, great video. This has been very informative. I think one of the biggest takeaways I've gotten is that you just got to keep on learning and try and keep up. Which is difficult. So, and people can start and get a good idea of that through your book, of course, which again is titled "The Great Disruption: How Geopolitics is Changing Companies, Managers, and Work." Anything that you'd like to leave with our guests today or our listeners?
Sure, I think you can find more about the book and me on my website, which is s-jandhyala.com. And looking to learn and engage.
Okay, terrific. All right. Well, Vidya, thank you very much for the time today. And everyone who tuned in, wherever you're watching or listening, again, always be sure to subscribe. Leave us a review. We always like the feedback that helps the show get better and better week by week. I'm Brian Caderna. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna podcast. See you next time.